Hi, I'm going to introduce you to our study, Critical Pause, Athletes' Experiences of Lockdown During COVID-19. We thought this was extremely important to study. It's something that we have never experienced in our own lifetimes, and it's not been studied in the athlete population. Because it's such a novel experience, we thought it was important to explore the stories of the athletes experiencing it. Keep in mind throughout this presentation that this was in phase 1 of lockdown, so try to remember the confusing, stressful nature of that time. I'll briefly explain the theoretical base of our study. We thought that athletes were going through an important critical moment. So athletes experience many critical moments throughout their career. These are highly subjective and can elicit positive or negative responses and outcomes. Now, these responses and outcomes are often based on the athlete's experience of athletic identity. While a high athletic identity can have positive outcomes, like a high commitment to your sport, this can be at the expense of exploring other roles which might be appropriate or important. So unfortunately, there can be negative outcomes when the dominant role is taken away quite suddenly. We compared two critical moments to lockdown due to COVID-19, which were athlete career transition and sport injury. Now, we know they're not the same, but as most things with COVID, we have to go with what we have and what we know. So the quality of a transition impacts or has the potential to impact an athlete's mental health and well-being. So think about how COVID might relate to some of the issues which make transition more problematic for athletes, such as higher levels of athletic identity, if a retirement is forced, someone's financial status, loss of perceived autonomy, and changes in routine. Similarly, with sport injury, the quality of which can impact mental health and well-being, they might experience concerns about returning at pre-injury fitness and performance levels, or anxiety relating to the progress of competitors and alienation from teammates and coaches. So essentially, athletes were denied what might be considered essential commodities like gyms, physios, and training facilities. They were quite isolated and overall experiencing a critical moment which forced a massive change in lifestyle, especially on elite athletes. So we thought it was quite important to examine. Critical moments can slow development or contribute to issues with mental ill health. But on the other hand, there can be positive outcomes, such as a renewed perspective, improved motivation, better appreciation of the sport, development of other areas of the self, and improved mental toughness, resilience, or however you want to conceptualize it. So essentially, we aim to understand how athletes told their stories of lockdown and what in those stories reflected the beliefs about how the pandemic might impact them as people and performers. So with that in mind, I will hand you over to Stewart for the methods section.
Participants were 8 elite level athletes, 3 of which were female and 5 male. The age range was between 23 and 34, with a mean age of 28, and participants were from a range of individual and team sports. We were unable to include the sports themselves due to confidentiality. We conducted a narrative analysis, which is concerned with the subjective lived experience of the individual and the stories that they tell. This allowed us to create a narrative structure, how the story is told, and narrative themes, what is being said by the participants. We collected the data during the first 3 weeks of May, and as you can see by this timeline here, there was an official government announcement that no sport was to be played, even indoors, at the time.
So let's have a look at the results. The athletes' narratives were best represented in 4 distinct sections. So firstly, COVID-19 as a threat to the athletes' goals. Then the ongoing consequences of COVID-19 on the athletes' personal and professional lives. Then you've got attempting to overcome the negative impacts. And lastly, reflecting on and adapting to the effects of COVID-19. So there were 4 narrative themes that were co-constructed between the research team and the participants, and these reinforced each stage of the narrative structure. So along the top, you've got the narrative structure, and underneath it, you have the themes. So there were 4 main themes. The first one were challenges. So these were factors that athletes found challenging, and it includes things like the abrupt end to sport, the lack of control and uncertainty over when they're going to return and what was going on, and also about the pressure that they put on themselves to maintain certain standards, or the pressure that other athletes were going to get ahead of them. The next theme was around loss, so a loss of conditioning, motivation, routines, and athletic identity. Then you've got some of the coping strategies, or some of the strategies that athletes use that help them psychologically. Things like acceptance, so accepting that they couldn't do anything about it, focusing on what they could control. You've also got them broadening their identities and trying new activities, but also developing new routines. And finally, silver linings. So these were some of the positive things that came out of COVID-19, such as a new appreciation of the sport and also an improved physical condition. So we're going to delve into these themes a little bit more, and I'll show you some quotes. So the first theme was the factors athletes found challenging. So what the athletes found particularly challenging was the uncertainty and the unknown about when they would return. But also the abrupt nature to how sport ended was quite challenging for some of the athletes. And finally, here is a quote that represents a lot of the pressure that some of the athletes were putting on themselves, and they were worrying about some of the competition. So I'll give you a couple seconds to look over that. Now, the second theme was around loss. So this was a loss to their motivation. So all of the athletes spoke about how their motivation dipped. There was also a loss of athletic identity, which is seen here in this quote from this athlete. Okay. So the third theme, we're looking at some of the strategies that benefited the athletes psychologically. So certain things included gaining acceptance of the situation and focusing on what they could control, but also trying new things and broadening their identities. So here are some quotes that capture that. And finally was silver linings. So these are some of the positive outcomes of COVID-19. So it includes a new appreciation of their sport, which is seen here. But COVID also gave athletes a chance to fully recover. So many athletes play with niggles, or they've got injuries that are kind of reoccurring. So having such a long break due to lockdown was a chance to heal properly. And this is shown in some of these quotes here. Okay, great. So we're going to head back over to Stewart, who's going to go over the implications and have a look at some of the future research that we're currently conducting.
Much of the reviews and commentary at the time of the pandemic and during the lockdown period were referring this as a transition or crisis transition. However, from our findings, we found that this would rather be a critical pause, where transitions are moving from one state to another. This period was actually a pause where athletes were removed from training and competing. From the participants' stories, we found that the inability to cope as a result of lockdown created a lot of anxiety and stress. So services should centre around mental health and well-being during these times. And this can be facilitated by telepsychological services such as Zoom, such as Skype, etc. For sport practitioners and sport psychologists, from our own applied experience, we found that there are difficulties of getting access to certain athletes, especially when the support staff are put on furlough. So just as athletes and others are going through a significant period of stress, we recommend that obviously applied sports psychologists and applied psychologists should practice self-care during these times also. As part of this study and future research, we are actually looking at the long-term effects of this in a longitudinal sense. So we are actually conducting further narrative analysis on the return to sport, and other research should also look at the impacts of the pandemic and lockdown experience on athletes' identity also.